Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm delighted that you're able to attend this session of our conference. So as you can see from the slide, the title for my talk is The Research Revolution, Emerging Discourses in Spirituality Studies. The inclusion of the word revolution in the title of this talk is neither accidental nor a rhyming convenience. The use of the term seeks to indicate that the current turn in research, a turn which, like a revolution, is fast-moving and unpredictable, has brought about significant changes in spirituality research in a short space of time. Like most revolutions, it is hope, idealism, and dreams of a better society that lie behind embracing the research revolution. Like other revolutions, the turn in spirituality research arises from an accumulation of discontents and dissatisfaction. I depend on others to theorize these discontents and dissatisfactions. I am personally influenced by the leadership development work at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Through their global outreach, they have documented the key discontents which are calling for a deeper conversion in our world today. Climate change, hunger, poverty, terrorism, violence, the destruction of nature and its multiple life forms. These challenges call for a new consciousness, a more alert, aware, intentional, and deeper presence to the cries of our global community. The development of such spiritual capacities will be foundational to the flourishing of our world. The cultivation of such authentically human capacities is a task for educational providers in their teaching, learning, and research activities. The classical university, as we know, was based on the unity of research and teaching. Then, more recently, university mission statements have been based on the unity of research, teaching, and practical application. The challenges of these current times, however, invite us to reconceive the mission of a 21st century university as to integrate research, teaching, application, with the added task of contributing to praxis of deep transformation within the self and society. That is, the self-implicating investigation of transformative praxis, which is at the core of spirituality studies, has much to contribute to the mission of the university in our challenging global circumstances. I therefore wish to situate this paper within the wider conceptualization of the notion of a university, which is taking place today. In particular, my approach is informed by the 3-volume work of Jane Dalton, Elizabeth Dalton, and Catherine Burns. These 3 researchers have provided practical accounts of the impact and significance of contemplative practices in tertiary education for the purposes of creating a more compassionate and respectful world. The work of Dalton, Dorman, and Burns allows us to situate this paper's reflection on the spiritual revolution in research within a wider soul searching that is taking place in universities today regarding their core social function. University leaders are aware that society's understanding of knowledge capital is changing. Accumulation of knowledge does not necessarily generate the dividend of wisdom. Zen teachers like the late Shunro Suzuki and many other educational theorists have highlighted how wisdom is more than filling the mind with information. Rather, wisdom requires emptying the mind. I quote Suzuki, "If the mind is clear, true knowledge is already yours." The generation of transformative insights in the academy may often be a long, slow, sometimes barely visible process. In our work, we take inspiration from the story of Catalan Carrico, one of the heroes of the COVID-19 vaccine development. Her work with her close collaborator, Dr. Drew Weissman of the University of Pennsylvania, laid the foundation for the stunningly successful vaccines made by Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna. For decades, she never found a permanent position and was just clinging to the fringes of academia. She needed grants to pursue ideas that seemed wild and fanciful. She did not get them, even as more mundane research was rewarded. As one colleague noted, when your idea is against the conventional wisdom that makes sense to the funders, it is very difficult to get a grant. At departmental level in universities, diverse disciplines such as religious studies and the sociology of religion have also been drivers of a revolution in the study of spirituality. Robert Orsi, Nancy Ammerman, and Meredith McGuire have been to the forefront of the revolution, which is seeking to attend with heart and soul, as well as mind and reason, to the intimate personal qualities of lived religion, mysticism, and spirituality. Studies such as Robert Orsi's investigation of the living spirituality of the annual fiesta of the Madonna of 115th Street in Harlem, New York, have shown that such expressions of lived spirituality could not adequately be reported through the anthropological lens of popular religion. The inner convictions of hope, despair, assurance, and consolation, which were evoked for the participants of this fiesta, also needed heartful, compassionate attention when creating an authentic sociological account of the fiesta. The coronavirus pandemic has amplified the importance of spiritual awareness in addressing the character of distress and suffering, which intense forms of isolation, loneliness, and vulnerability have been generated during the pandemic. The pandemic stripped back many of the outer technologies of healthcare, visits from family or friend, activity clubs, personal conversations with a doctor, so as to reveal the importance of technologies of the self during such times of crisis. It was the spiritual capacity of a healthcare professional to be attentive, aware, alert, kind, present, and compassionate, which has been the ultimate gift to patients in our recent healthcare crisis. In acknowledging this reality, we must now choose to promote and support research into the dynamics, growth, transformation, and evolution of such technologies of the self. Against the background of the pandemic and other global challenges previously mentioned, spirituality is expanding as an agreed term with which to discuss the efforts people make through meditation, pilgrimage, retreat, prayer, journaling, reflective practices, slow living, contemplative arts, and digital apps, to be fully present to deeper, invisible dimensions of their personal identity and external reality. In the language of the French philosopher Michel Foucault, these technologies of the self permit individuals to effect by their own means, or with the help of others, a certain number of operations on their bodies and souls, thoughts, conduct, and way of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of calm, focus, wisdom, or perseverance. Foucault distinguishes the current turn towards technologies of the self from three other technologies: technologies of production, technologies of communication, technologies of power, whereby people may be managed to fit a system rather than personally empowered within it. In his 1982 Vermont lecture series on this subject, he sketched out how the roots of technologies of the self may be traced to the Hellenistic era. At that time, there was a turn to writing about the self, a practice later reflected in Christian spirituality through the production of the Confessions of St. Augustine. Foucault's insights were developed further by Pierre Hadot, who found the meditation writings of Marcus Aurelius as rigorous and codified and systematic as the famous spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola, I quote. There are other emerging disciplinary insights which are impacting on the current directions in which spirituality research is moving. The neurophenomenological research of Francesco Varela, the Chilean biologist, philosopher, and neuroscientist, led a turn towards developing what he called the view from within. He was unhappy with accounts of inner world knowing, which sometimes did little more than test, catalogue, and discuss its readily accessible features. Varela's work was groundbreaking in that it provided a preliminary phenomenological method for gathering data in the realm of intuitive experience. Asserting the significance of times of silence in interviewing is a key contribution of Varela, since the interviewer is facilitating a reconnection with a profound experience, and so must create the conditions where the experience may be inwardly retraced. Similarly, Jorge Ferrer has been critical of the empiricism imported from clinical settings, which has attempted to subvert the mystery which is at the heart of spirituality studies. In Ferrer's transpersonal postmodern culture graph, we study spirituality at a time when there has been a shift in focus from a Cartesian ego that experiences the sacred as other to a vision of a complete human being who naturally and spontaneously participates in the deeper sacred dimensions of life. In particular, Ferrer situates the study of spirituality within the wider post-colonial revaluation of emic epistemologies. A rich appreciation of the nature of embodied knowing is also contributing to the participatory turn in spirituality which Ferrer advances. As Lisa Isherwood and Elizabeth Stewart observed, we must guard against what they label the disappearance of the real, lived, laughing, suffering, and birthing body into technical accounts which can fail. Firstly, to illuminate such experiences and how they have revelatory mystery at their core. And secondly, how such revelations can be transformative, even for the researcher. There is an inevitable scholarly vulnerability in spirituality research. And so, against this brief background sketch, we can see that great efforts are being made to find the research methods which can identify, map, interrogate, and mobilize the spiritual revolution which has been taking place in health education, justice, caring, and other domains of life. This revolution in the focus and methods of research has many movements and manifestations. In the discussion which follows, I hope to outline the impact of the above developments within three research paradigms. At the beginning, I wish to look at the paradigm of first-person practices of inquiry. In an essay by Professor David Coughlan from Trinity College Dublin entitled Developing a Spirituality of Scholarship, a first-person methodological approach, which was published in the Dutch journal Studies in Spirituality in 2020, Coughlan describes the essence of a first-person method as involving, I quote, seeking to maintain inner and outer attention, awareness and presence about what is happening and what part I am playing in creating and sustaining patterns of interaction and non-response. Elsewhere, Coughlan distinguishes between first-person approaches, which take a researcher upstream, where attention is focused on one's own spiritual frameworks, core commitments and practices, or downstream, where the focus will be on the lived expression of inner frameworks and commitments. Heuristic approaches to spirituality research, as described in Nevin Sultan's 2018 publication, Heuristic Inquiry, Researching Human Experience Holistically, can provide a fruitful first-person approach to upstream and downstream research. Heuristic inquiry explores spiritual issues in personal human experiences, which frequently are embedded in social, culture, and potentially universal factors. This form of inquiry employs rigorous, evidence-based data collection, analysis, and evaluation, which can be compatible with in vivo digital processing. When heuristic researchers explore the subjective experience of a phenomenon, they regularly provide an acknowledgement of their personal standpoint when commencing the study. For example, in a Malaysian study entitled A Heuristic Study of Clients' Spiritual Experiences in the Counseling Process, there is an acknowledgement at the outset that the researcher has gone through a deep spiritual transformation as a therapist and as a client. In the preliminary material of another doctoral dissertation entitled Windows to the Soul, a heuristic inquiry into the use of the eyes as portals to innate presence, the researcher acknowledges that she has persistently wondered why her experience of the proximity of divinity, mediated through the eyes of a spiritual guide, does not seem to be part of spiritual guidance training. In a third dissertation entitled The Lived Experience of Being Spiritual for an Atheist, a Heuristic Study, the researcher acknowledged that her experience as a spiritually committed atheist, collected through extensive personal journaling, prepared her to hear what her research participants were sharing. A shared literacy is therefore the foundation of heuristic inquiry. Capturing the intimate truths being shared in such a research approach depends on the resonance which they obtain in the heart and soul of the researcher. The world-renowned psychologist of spiritual coping, Ken Pargament, tells a story from his practice that illustrates how the chink in the heart of the researcher is the space where the light of the data enters. He calls it Alice's story, and I just offer an abbreviated version of it here. Alice was a woman in her 40s who came to Ken's office suffering from bipolar illness. He had worked with Alice for probably a year, trying to offer something different, but wasn't any more successful than the legion of therapists she had previously met. But then there was a moment, one day, when almost like a lamentation, Alice cried out, "When will this suffering end?" Ken asked a question he had not previously asked. Where do you turn for solace in the midst of your suffering? She stopped and she said, "Well, I never told anybody this before, but the first time I was hospitalized when I was 13 or 14 and was so frightened, I had a warm feeling in the center of my body, and that warm feeling spoke to me." And Ken said, "Well, what did the warm feeling say?" Alice said, "It said, I'm with you, I'll always be with you, and I'll be with you for the rest of your life, no matter how bad it gets." Ken then inquired about the identity of this voice who was talking to her. For Alice, this was God. When she finished sharing her reflections on this experience, Ken asked if she had talked to any of her other therapists about this experience. Alice said, "Well, they already think I'm crazy." Giving the space for this conversation was a turning point in Alice's healing journey. And after that, Ken gave more time speaking about spirituality with Alice. When Ken wrote this story several years later, Alice had never been hospitalized again, with the exception of just one brief period. This type of attentiveness to the foundations of spiritual phenomena, experiences, and practice is essential for mapping the contours of the landscapes which we explore. Such research ultimately requires humility. The future first-person spirituality researcher is faced with a choice between the path of the warrior and the path of the sage. As we move along the research path of the sage, a researcher is challenged to remain free from conditioned responses and to hold a relaxed alertness to what is emerging. As Mary Froelich has suggested, studying within the discipline of spirituality necessarily engages the scholar in spiritual disciplines. The first-person spirituality researcher is called upon to exercise the full rigor of their own practice of discernment and courage on the research journey. Other first-person approaches which are part of the research revolution in spirituality are intuitive inquiry as developed by Rosemary Anderson, organic inquiry as developed by Jennifer Clemens, and integral inquiry as developed by Sean Esbern Hargens. In these approaches, the data analysis stage of the research journey involves the cognitive integration of liminal spiritual insights. The foundational assumptions of all first-person research methods are challenging. The assumptions include that the research topics will frequently emerge from the researcher's life experience, that the research will require interior and exterior processes. Thirdly, intuitive knowing may be incorporated into the research journey. Fourthly, transformation of self and others might take place across the research journey. And finally, research supervision in this paradigm may have the character of spiritual accompaniment, in that it facilitates encountering the sacred, as well as developing research outcomes and findings. While much more could be said about first-person inquiry, in the interests of time, I will now turn to second-person group practices of inquiry. Second-person research practices have as their focus research questions which are of mutual concern in a group setting, and research actions which collectively pursue a disciplined inquiry into these questions. The second-person examples which I will explore for spirituality researchers are mindful action research, spiritual group dialogues, and Lectio Divina. Firstly, we notice that since action research emphasizes investigating real-world challenges, it is often collaborative between researchers or between researchers and participants. Action research puts a strong emphasis on what may be called the democratization of knowledge, or the reality of group wisdom. Such collective wisdom may be facilitated through well-designed contemplative dialogue processes. The benefits from this research approach accrue both to the researcher and to the community where the research takes place. Action research prioritizes addressing challenges which are shared by a community, rather than simply addressing the concerns of the researcher alone. As a research approach, action research emphasizes collaborative knowledge generation. In this research method, neither the professional researcher nor the stakeholder group is exceptionally privileged. Since so much of spiritual practice is a communal group undertaking, it is clear that action research can be well suited to assisting a spiritual community or network to reflect deeply on its life, identity, mission, and future direction. For example, individual spiritual directors find in their peer supervision group that there is a growing concern amongst their directees regarding the environment. Firstly, much may be discovered by the directors co-investigating the response which they feel called to make to this concern. Then secondly, reflection on the responses which their interventions generate will bring the group learning deeper. Indeed, many of the newest challenges which arise for spiritual accompaniment networks, for chaplaincy associations, and for inter-spiritual minister professional bodies could be fruitfully explored in action research. If this research journey includes a spiritual biography of the organization, that is, a map of its collective learning history, then the opportunities to capture and stimulate learning from the individual experience of group members will be further enriched. The group practice of writing a learning history or spiritual biography will enable the members to collectively engage in experiencing, questioning, reflecting on, and identifying the dynamics at the heart of the spiritual service which they provide. And this practice can build deeper freedom for the future. If we assume a more social focus, a contemplative practice group may wish to collectively research the implications of something like the Sustainable Development Goals for their daily lives, using skills of silence, journaling, and mindful movement, so as to deepen their presence individually and collectively to these profound global challenges. As interventions are identified and implemented by members of the group, the data of experience can be brought back into the circle of contemplative attentiveness in order to create transformative, authentic research findings regarding how to deepen the contemplative living of the Sustainable Development Goals in daily life. Such a proposal for contemplative action research that is socially oriented draws on the inspiration of Stanley Ward and Stephanie Varner Hughes. The contemplative action inquiry framework could usefully integrate the proposal of Culham, Lynn, and Oxford regarding the use of spiritual group dialogue in the research process. In their book, Towards a Spiritual Research Paradigm, Exploring New Ways of Knowing, Research, and Being, Culham, Lynn, and Oxford take the contemplative action research process further by proposing that the circle of researchers be intentionally extended. The research group will seek to collaborate with those who will be affected by the decisions it makes in finding a way forward. Frederick Laloux's Guide to Creating Organizations Inspired by the Next Stage of Human Consciousness argues that this type of contemplative, participatory, research active organization will be less focused on external goals and more attuned to life-seeking dynamics which are already at work. Finally, I turn to exploring Lectio Divina strategies for second-person research. The practice of Lectio Divina found its way from the monastery into educational settings over the past 10 years. Mary Keeter's recent book, Lectio Divina as Contemplative Pedagogy, offers many insights into what the practice may offer researchers who are collectively exploring the spirituality of a text. Poetry, drama, novel, or images may also be used. A researcher who uses this approach recognizes the invaluable wisdom which may be gleaned from a classic when it is read collectively in a deliberate and directed research process. The reading group often acts like a focus group in that there may be a shared aspect of life. For example, the experience of homelessness, the daily practice of gardening, or continuing a life journey after the death of a partner. Whether it is a poem from John of the Cross or an entry from the letters of Elijah Hillison, the first act, Lectio, is to collectively attend to a slow reading of the text by a single voice. In this phase, the initial impact of the text and reverberating phrases and words are recorded by each person. In the second step of the research journey, meditatio, the wisdom of the heart is brought into engagement with the text. What memories and connections are being evoked by the text for each person? In the third phase of the research journey, oratio, the participants seek to express in their own words their most authentic response to the reading, in the awareness that oratio, which could be translated as prayer, is fundamentally primary speech. Finally, in the fourth stage of the research journey, contemplatio, the participants rest in an awareness of what has changed in them and for them through encountering this text or this image. This type of research journey with co-researchers seeks to learn the impact of creative texts and images on the soul. In the wisdom of Rumi, we hear, the soul has been given its own ears to hear things that the mind does not understand. While Mary Keeter has used this research approach with young offenders, there are many more communities whose lives could be enriched if time was taken to learn about words or images which may transform, heal, restore, or encourage or disturb along the journey of life. We might conclude this section of our discussion of research and spirituality with a quote from Elijah Hillison. When I think of the faces of that squad of armed, green, uniformed guards, my God, those faces. I look at them, each in turn, from behind the safety of my prison window, and I have never been so frightened of anything in my life as I was of those faces. I sank to my knees with the words that preside over human life. And God made each person after God's likeness. That passage spent a difficult morning with me. Overall, we see therefore that second-person contemplative research can make an important contribution to a transformative future for our world. So let us now turn to third-person research paradigm. Spirituality researchers who approach their studies from a third-person perspective may intentionally distantiate themselves from their research topic. But their profound respect for the research field which they are entering still generates creative and innovative forms of inquiry. A study which immediately comes to mind, in which a classic third-person ethnographic approach has been revised and adapted with contemplative intent, is Courtney Bender's The New Metaphysicals. The research is an ethnography of spiritual practitioners in the vicinity of Harvard Divinity School. She brings an alert awareness to the research of her personal entanglement in inherited scholarly discourse regarding spiritual experience. In recognition of her own entanglement, Bender believes that it is helpful for her to trace the genealogy of interests that a sociology scholar like herself brings to an encounter with a spiritual practitioner. In her choice of the term entanglement, Bender aligns herself epistemologically with new physics, rather than the preceding Newtonian physics paradigm. That latter paradigm shaped the sociological discourse of modernity created by Max Weber. The term entanglement acknowledges that Bender is not a disconnected analyst of the narratives of her research participants. As a social scientist, she is entangled in a web of international networks of universities, grant-making foundations, religious and non-religious organizations, and other actors and institutions which have this ability to support or dismiss the research she produces. Weber, by contrast, asserted that for the modern person, there are no mysterious, incalculable forces in the public realm. One can, in principle, investigate all things in the academy by calculation alone. I quote Weber: "The fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world. The ultimate and most sublime values have retreated from public life into the transcendent realm of mystic life." In the sure knowledge of her entangled academic foundations, Bender has intentionally avoided the types of distinctions which could invade the narratives of the spiritual practitioners she interviewed, such as separating religious practices derived from institutions and traditions from spiritual practices that are sometimes characterized as individualist, idiosyncratic, and consumerist. Bender's interviewee, Eric, typically manifested this type of blending by integrating in himself the legacy of a German Benedictine nun, Hildegard of Bingen, with a personal calling to provide spiritual music at health expos. Bender's research also illustrates how sociological distinction between a religious experience on the one hand and an account of that experience on the other may not work in practice. A number of Bender's informants insisted that their accounts manifested the vital energies of their original awakening, such as the interviewee, Mike, who informed Bender that he would not recount any of his personal experiences in their second meeting because, he added, speaking about them is so powerful that I would be exhausted afterwards. Bender did not seek to neatly package the diversity of practices which she met, but acknowledged that there were many what she called overlapping spiritualities in her sample. She sought to depict honestly the metaphysical realm of vital energies, etheric bodies, and past lives that her interviewees asserted could be accessed through esoteric techniques, as well as quasi-scientific methods like astrophotography and hypnotic regression. At the same time, she exercised her analytical skills in identifying the family resemblances and in tracing the historic affiliation of the narrated contemporary spiritual practices to 19th and 20th century antecedents, such as transcendentalism, theosophy, and New Thought, which Catherine Albanese named as the American metaphysical religion. A spirit of humility permeates Bender's third-person inquiry. She does not attempt to create a grand, impermeable narrative for the spiritual experiences which she researches. She represents how her informants typically understand themselves to have very individualized practices, and yet she does not shy away from analyzing them collectively. And she provides plausible genealogies for the social and cultural lineages of the practices she records. A second study which comes to mind in terms of stretching the frameworks of our research tents as spirituality scholars is that of Amy Shawanda, a final year PhD candidate at Trent University in Canada. Her study explores dreams as data for spirituality research. Amy Shawanda is a citizen of the Wikwemikong unceded Indian Reserve on Manitoulin Island. Her studies are located within the only Indigenous Studies doctoral program in Canada. The doctoral program is part of a wider effort to decolonize academic institutions and recognize the unique contribution of Indigenous knowledges to global sustainable development. In 2015, the SDGs recognized that there will be no truly sustainable development without protecting the traditional knowledge and wisdom of Indigenous peoples. Since globally there are approximately 370 million people who identify themselves as members of Indigenous cultures, there is much research to take place to identify the spiritual vision which informs the sustainable approach to natural resource management, climate protection, and food production, which is inherent to Indigenous communities. We are all aware that the climate alarm bells are ringing as we enter what the United Nations has declared the final decade of action to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. In March 2020, the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency convened actors from around the world in a digital, flight-free conference entitled People and Planet, Faith in the 2030 Agenda. The event sought to elevate and enrich partnerships towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, with a focus on strengthening linkages and collaboration with the spiritual wisdom of Indigenous networks. In diverse locales, for example, forest management in India, rubber production in South America, and controlled fires in the Philippines, state officials are now relying upon Indigenous people to use traditional knowledge to identify and prevent future environmental threats. For the previously mentioned researcher Amy Shawanda and her people, the Anishika-Abek people, dreams are a central spiritual practice in sustainable development, as they remind people that each person is entangled with the cosmological energies. There is no simple separation between the world as dreamed and the world as lived. Through the experience of dreams, relationships are understood to extend beyond the material world. Consequently, Shawanda seeks within Indigenous research methods and methodology to privilege those insights which appear amongst her research participants within their dreams and visions. While some Indigenous insights are common knowledge shared by all members of a community, some specialized types of information are preserved by knowledge keepers who have a deeper experience. In North American Indigenous communities, these people are often selected as children and carefully trained by elders. In Australian communities, the knowledge keepers may inherit this role within a family line. In general, Indigenous knowledge keepers and traditional elders are afforded considerable respect in their home communities. Spirituality scholars in the future may have a special role in honoring and inviting this type of spiritual wisdom into our conversations and conferences for the well-being of our world. Amy Shawanda poses interesting questions to ourselves as spirituality researchers for the future. She notes that her ideas for research are often revealed to her while sleeping. How can we provide hospitality to such intimate moments between Indigenous people and the spirit world? How can we honor that type of spiritual knowledge in what could be a colonial academic event? Having surveyed the theme of this lecture, I wish to conclude by noting that not all revolutions are violent and destructive interventions in history. We have the example of the Estonian singing revolution to inspire us. Beginning in the mid-1980s, Estonians began taking advantage of their unique, rich cultural heritage in choral music, so as to encourage a national reawakening. Estonians gathered in thousands and eventually in hundreds of thousands to celebrate their heritage in song in what became known as the Singing Revolution. Raising the banned Estonian flag while gathering en masse and singing banned patriotic songs, the movement eventually gained the support of the Republic's ruling Communist Party in defying Moscow. It faced down Soviet tanks and successfully declared Estonian independence. And so let us here today end with the words of a great songwriter to inspire our own revolution. These words come from a Leonard Cohen song, 1,000 Kisses Deep, which was recorded on his 10 New Songs album, and it's here on the screen. You lose your grip, and then you slip into the masterpiece. Thank you very much.